One of the quickest tools in Photoshop for creating selections is color range. Now, color range is located underneath select in the main navigational menu. Now, when you select it, it'll appear as a window and it'll have a variety of different options that you can use to make specific selections in your photographs. Now, the first thing that you'll see is there is a select option. Now, when you click on the select option, a drop-down menu will appear, and this will allow you to choose to create a selection based on the colors in your image. And in this case, you can see that we have reds, yellows, greens, cyans, blues, and magentas, or you can specify the highlights, midtones, and shadows in your photograph in order to actually create a selection from. Now, you also have this outer gamut section here, and that's based on the colors that primarily sit outside the gamut of the working space profile or the output profile that you're going to be using to actually print your photographs on. And that's something that we'll get into more detail and discussion about in the color management module. So it's something that you really don't want to worry about at this point in time. Now, what I tend to like to do with color range is to utilize it in order to quickly select either the highlights or shadows, or in some cases the shadows and midtones. So a combination of either highlights, shadows, and midtones according to my image. Now, sometimes you may have an image where the highlights are just on the edge or the verge of being blown out, but you still want to be able to add contrast to the rest of your image. So what I like to do is to be able to select the highlights like so, and then invert the selection. So then what you'll see is instead of selecting the highlights, it's actually excluded the highlights from my selection, and then I can actually choose to click OK to create the selection. Now, this will basically enable you to quickly add an adjustment layer with the highlights of your image being excluded. So when you actually add, say, a levels adjustment or a curves adjustment, and you start to add contrast into your image, it's only actually adding that into the shadows and midtone areas without actually affecting the highlights and blowing them out further. Now, the other thing you'll notice here is that you have the selection preview down the bottom with a drop-down menu. You can choose to specify how you want to actually preview your selection. In this case, I really tend to like the grayscale preview, but you have the option of selecting from black matte, and as you can see there, the highlights have been selected in a sort of black matte or a white matte finish. And finally, you have quick mask. So whatever color you set in quick mask, in this case it happens to be set on green, will display as your preview of the areas in your photograph that you're actually making a color range selection from. Now, I'm just going to set that back to grayscale. But what if you want to make a selection based on a specific tonal value or color value in your photograph? Well, you don't have to actually use the default settings or options in color range. What you can choose instead is actually to go to the select drop-down menu and select sampled colors. Now, this will give you a little eyedropper for your mouse, and it'll enable you to be able to click on an area within your photograph that you want to make a selection from. So in this case, what I can do is I'm going to specify the area beside the seagull on the jetty that is currently white as the area I want to actually make a selection from. So when I click on it, that area becomes the center focus area that the actual selection is made from. Now, when you use sample colors, you have a couple of different actual options to choose from. The first being fuzziness. Now, fuzziness will simply allow you to increase or decrease the amount of selection being made in your photograph based on that particular tonal value. So as I increase it, it starts to add more values that are very similar and close to the one that I actually specified. Now, along with fuzziness, we have the localized color clusters. Now, localized color clusters will allow you to actually predefine the area where the actual selection occurs. So if we turn that on by checking this little box, we have a little range slider that appears. Now the range slider will essentially determine how much area around the original selection will be included, or around the original value or tonal value that's been selected will be included in the actual selection. So if I start to reduce the range slider, what you'll notice is that the selection area or the circumference of the selection starts to reduce based on that central point where I originally clicked. So you can almost go to a really fine area that you want your selection to be created from. Now in most cases I don't tend to use this option. I really prefer to go for the entire image based on the actual selection as opposed to just this area, but it would work quite well if, say for example, I just wanted to select this seagull, but I only wanted to select just the seagull itself. See, what I could do then is just reduce it to about 4 or 5%, and it selected the majority of the seagull, and then what I could do from there is refine my selection by just getting rid of the rest of the jetties. So from that perspective it is quite useful. But in most cases I tend to leave it set at 100%. Now along with the range slider you also have the option to choose from an additive eyedropper and a subtractive eyedropper. So they allow you to basically add to your selection or actually subtract from your selection in color range. From there you can also choose to save your selection and load it at a later date if you intend on using that selection over and over again for a variety of different adjustments. So that's color range in a nutshell. It is very fast at creating selections if you know exactly what you want, and it has been very useful for me throughout the years, especially when I'm isolating areas such as highlights or shadows in my photographs.